So it's been an interesting past couple of weeks for Canada and Alberta, specifically where the Premier Danielle Smith, she's made a couple of headlines in our country. Last week, she participated in an event in Calgary with Tucker Carlson, Jordan Peterson. She started off this week announcing new policies around transgenderism and giving parents more rights when it comes to the education around transgenderism. And she capped it all off by going to Ottawa, establishing an Alberta office, and calling for the resignation of our Minister of the Environment, Steven Guilbeault.
Steven Guilbeault, I had hoped that we'd be able to have a constructive relationship, and he's demonstrated that he's an ideologue. He doesn't listen, he doesn't honor the Constitution, he ignores court judgments, and he continues barreling ahead even though his actions are illegal. So I'm very hopeful, I've said this before, I'd like to see a change in the Environment Ministry so that we can reset our relationship.
So quite the past couple of days for Alberta and Premier Danielle Smith. It's another political development that's been happening in Alberta that reflects the conflict between Western Canada more generally and the federal government in Ottawa. There are not only policy and economic disagreements, there's a deeper social, cultural aspect to it. It's now been known as Western Alienation for a long time now in Canada. By definition, Western Alienation encompasses British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, which have some point have all felt some sort of marginalization was in Canada. So in this video, I'll give you a brief overview of the history of Western Alienation in Canada, and you'll see that it's something that's been happening for a long time now. It's one of the many difficulties that we have, and that impacts unity in our country. The history of Western alienation is tied to the westward expansion of Canada in the 19th and 20th century, where the federal government was encouraging European immigrants, especially to the prairies, with the aim of developing agriculture and settling the vast territories that were called the Northwest at the time. Manitoba and British Columbia were established first, with Alberta and Saskatchewan being formed in 1905. That wave of immigration established a whole different cultural landscape compared to Eastern Canada, the Maritimes, Ontario, and Quebec, where most people were aged around 25 years old. They were living a rural, self-reliant life, surviving the harsh winters of the prairies. People were also different, having a much more diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds, whether they were Doukhobors, Mennonites, Ukrainians, and they didn't feel as attached to the old political parties back in Ottawa or of the social issues that were going on between the Anglophones and the Francophones. The federal government also introduced the national policy aimed at developing manufacturing was in Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes, and to do that, they imposed tariffs on American products. The West, which was much more focused on agriculture and trade with the US, could have benefited much more from free trade, but the national policy essentially forced them to buy expensive manufactured goods that were from Ontario or Quebec, while all the while exporting their resources to the same provinces for a reduced price. Now, the discovery of natural resources would completely change the game for Western Canada, and especially Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Leduc blew in, and the oil discoveries, not only in Alberta, but in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, signaled the opening of the West's industrial revolution.
But at the same time, all of this prosperity and all of these new natural resources brought tensions with the federal government because of the whole issue around who would be able to manage these resources. Saskatchewan and Alberta would get the famous Pierre Elliott Trudeau treatment. The relationship between the western provinces and the federal government became very bad during the tenure of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So Trudeau won the election of 1980 with a majority, was out winning one seat west of Manitoba, which is pretty illustrative of how not liked he was in Western Canada. And in response to the oil shocks of the 1970s, he introduced what we call the National Energy Program. Introduced in 1980, it was aimed to redistribute oil wealth across Canada and increase again federal control over the oil industry. It was going to tax exports, limit foreign investments, freeze the price of it. It did have a lasting economic effect on the economies of Alberta and in Saskatchewan, but when it comes to the oil industry in Alberta, it led to a lot of unemployment and a lack of investment and an overall lack of development of our natural resources in Alberta. During that time, there was also competition with Quebec, who was itself advocating for more autonomy. One issue was the equalization program. For the people who don't know, the equalization program is essentially a wealth transfer from province to province, aimed at reducing disparities between Canadian provinces by providing payments to the ones that aren't as wealthy as others. Quebec's been a pretty large recipient of equalization payment, while Alberta and Saskatchewan, because of their resource wells, has paid a lot of that. There were also constitutional debates happening in Canada during the 1980s and 90s, notably Lake Meech and Charlottetown, where both of these would have introduced constitutional amendments within Canada that would have given Quebec a distinct nation status, more provincial powers, constitutional veto rights for provinces. The Lake Meech ended up being rejected by Newfoundland and Manitoba, whereas Charlottetown got rejected in a national referendum, and it got rejected heavily in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, and in Quebec for all of them vastly different reasons. And all of this contributed ultimately to a national unity crisis. So what did Alberta, Saskatchewan, how did they reform this? Well, they created the Reform Party. A very bad pun. The Reform Party of Canada was funded in 1987 by Preston Manning. The Reform Party positioned itself as a right-of-center alternative to the established parties and focused on issues like fiscal conservatism, and it ultimately advocated for more Western representation in Canada. The Reform Party actually gained a lot of traction in Canada, and in 1993 they won the third most seats in the House of Commons. In 1997 they were the official opposition to. They would eventually merge later on with other parties to form the Conservative Party that we have today. Western Alienation took sort of a break when Stephen Harper was in power, but it's definitely made a resurgence since Justin Trudeau's become Prime Minister. Since he took office in 2015, I think it's safe to say that Western Alienation has seen levels that we've probably never seen before. There's really three main issues that have dominated the sort of discussion between Western provinces and the federal government ever since Trudeau took office. The first one obviously being the carbon tax, which is seen as affecting disproportionately the economies that are heavily dependent on oil and gas of Alberta and Saskatchewan.
We are going to place a price on the pollution that causes climate change from coast to coast to coast.
The second one is the development of energy projects and the building of pipelines. Alberta and Saskatchewan want to expand their oil and gas markets by building more pipelines like the Trans Mountain Expansion, the Keystone, the Northern Gateway. Because of environmental regulations, a bunch of regulatory red tape, and just the overall negative image that right now the oil and gas sector has, this hasn't been happening. They've canceled the building of pipelines. Some projects have been bought by the federal government, but nothing is really happening still. The third one that's been kind of underrated and hasn't really been talked about in the news is the agricultural impact that the federal government's been having on the markets of Saskatchewan and Alberta. In 2019, China banned the import of Canadian canola seeds. While all of these trade disputes are part of geopolitics and all of that stuff, there's more of a debate around how the Trudeau administration is dealing with their diplomatic relationship with countries like China that present huge market opportunities for Canadian farmers, for Albertan and Saskatchewan farmers, and the impact that negative diplomatic relationships can have on their economic prosperity. It doesn't help right now, too, that the environment minister that we have in Ottawa is Steven Guilbeault, who's an activist, some would say would be even a radical environmentalist.
Greenpeace is climbing the world's tallest building today to tell the world not to be fooled by the Liberal government.
He was director of Greenpeace in Quebec, and back in 2001, he even climbed the CN Tower to protest climate change. He doesn't seem to be the kind of guy that would be willing to compromise on any sort of issues when it comes to oil, gas, or the environment.
Steven Guilbeault, I don't know. He's a maverick. He doesn't seem to care about the law, doesn't care about the Constitution. I do, and we're going to make sure that we assert that.
At the same time, he's approving projects like La Baie du Nord in Newfoundland, which sort of makes his position completely hypocritical because he's not letting Alberta and Saskatchewan develop their projects. So it's not surprising that this week Danielle Smith in Ottawa explicitly asked for the removal of Steven Guilbeault as the environment minister.
Because he's acting in the way he is, in a lawless way, unconstitutional way, I think it's pretty clear that the relationships broke down with him, and I would like to see him removed, yes.
So Western Alienation today, who's at the forefront of Western representation within the federal government? It's undoubtedly Alberta and Saskatchewan, and they're both represented by Danielle Smith and Scott Moe. Danielle Smith has been the Alberta Premier since October 2022, and she's established herself as a pretty harsh critic of the Trudeau government. Apart from the carbon tax, which obviously they're opposed against, she's also introduced the Alberta Sovereignty Act. The Alberta Sovereignty Act would allow Alberta to refuse the enforcement of federal laws or policies that the province would deem harmful to its own interests. interests. She's also talked about creating the Alberta pension plan and getting away from the Canada pension plan, similarly to Quebec, essentially. Now, for Scott Moe, he's been the Premier of Saskatchewan since 2018. He's, again, against the carbon tax, but this time, since January of this year, he's actually stopped collecting it, which is a pretty bold move.
Effective January the 1st, Sask Energy will stop collecting and submitting the carbon tax on natural gas, effectively providing Saskatchewan residents with the very same exemption that the federal government is giving heating oil in Atlantic Canada.
There's also parties in both provinces that advocate for the complete separation of Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Western Canada from Canada, Quebec style. So what's the future of Western alienation right now in Canada? I think there's all of these common denominators anytime Western alienation rises in Canada. There's either the federal government, Trudeau, either the father or the son, or anytime there's an environmental policy that's implemented at the federal level that's seen as being bad for the respective natural resource industries. You can't forget the cultural and social aspect of it, because whatever your economy is based out of, it's going to influence how you are as people and your culture, right? So I think there's been a lot of feelings of disrespect, of disregard on the part of Alberta and Saskatchewan vis-a-vis the federal government. And again, it doesn't help to have someone like Steven Guilbeault who's not willing to compromise really on anything. And I think for the sake of cooperation, it would probably be better for him to step down. We'll see how that goes. You know, I'm from Quebec. I love Alberta. I love Saskatchewan. You know, I love you guys. And yeah, I think it's part of our history as a nation where Western alienation has been part of it for such a long time. It's kind of like Quebec, where we've had our struggles with the federal government and we've all, like, at one point wanted to be on our own. I think ultimately we're stronger together, and I think that's a good message to carry on. That's what I advocate for, ultimately. I hope you guys learned something new about Canadian history, Canadian culture, and can use it to contribute to national unity and to make our country better overall. If you like this sort of content, like it, leave a comment, subscribe. I appreciate the support very much. Thank you, guys.